On the morning of September 15, 1940, Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs revealed the same pattern they had observed for weeks. Scattered across Kent and Sussex were dozens of makeshift wooden barns nestled among fields, their sagging roofs weathered by time, with hay bales visible through open doors. German intelligence officers classified them as agricultural buildings, deeming them unworthy of targeting. That afternoon, however, 27 Spitfires emerged from these barns to intercept a German formation of Heinkel bombers over London, contributing to what became known as Battle of Britain Day. The Germans had been misled not by sophisticated camouflage or elaborate decoy airfields, but by Britain's innovative strategy to disguise their most advanced fighters as part of a rural landscape, operating them under conditions that would have horrified Luftwaffe ground crews. In 1940, military doctrine called for purpose-built infrastructure. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf 109E required specialized ground support equipment, trained technicians, and secure workspaces. The notion of housing a 9,000-pound fighter aircraft, representing 12,500 hours of skilled labor, inside a hastily constructed wooden shed amidst farm equipment, seemed not only unorthodox but recklessly negligent. Yet by August 1940, RAF Fighter Command had dispersed numerous Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons to satellite airfields where aircraft were housed in structures that appeared indistinguishable from rural Sussex when viewed from 6,000 meters above. This was not desperation, it was a deliberate strategy. And it worked because the RAF understood something the Luftwaffe did not. In total war, the aircraft that can fly tomorrow is more valuable than the aircraft housed securely today. German air doctrine in 1940 focused on concentration. Luftwaffe squadrons operated from established airfields like Wissant, Kallemark, and cafes, which featured hardened shelters, permanent buildings, and the infrastructure needed for sustained operations. A typical Jagdgeschwader base housed 40 to 50 fighters with dedicated maintenance facilities, ammunition storage, and fuel depots within a secure perimeter. This approach made sense to planners who believed their superiority depended on concentrated striking power and rapid sortie rates. The RAF, however, reached a different conclusion. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who commanded 11 Group throughout the Battle of Britain, wrote in a directive from July 1940, "Dispersion is life. Concentration is death from the air." His orders mandated that no more than one squadron, typically 12 to 16 operational aircraft, should occupy any single location that could be identified from aerial reconnaissance. Rather than creating elaborate camouflage for major airfields like Biggin Hill or Kenley, Park staff identified numerous satellite landing grounds. Flat field with basic drainage, often requisitioned farmland still surrounded by hedges and agricultural buildings. By August 15, 1940, 11 Group operated 27 separate sites across southeast England. Some, like RAF Hawkinge, were established airfields, while others, such as Staplehurst and Lympton, were little more than grass strips with a windsock. The key to the system's success was not simply the dispersion itself, although the Luftwaffe also used forward airfields, but Britain's willingness to sacrifice the comfort and convenience required for proper air bases to function smoothly. The engineering specifications reveal the philosophy. A standard Luftwaffe hardened shelter in 1940 measured 18 by 24 meters, constructed from reinforced concrete 60 centimeters thick at the roof, designed to withstand all but a direct hit from a 250 kilograms bomb. Building such a shelter required 90 tons of concrete, steel reinforcements, and 3 weeks of labor from skilled engineers. The RAF's alternative was a Bellman hangar. These temporary structures use a framework of curved steel tubes covered with Hessian fabric treated with bitumen. A single Bellman hangar, measuring just 10 by 13 meters, barely enough to house one Spitfire with its wings attached, could be erected by 6 men in under 8 hours at a total material cost of £127. Critics within the Air Ministry argued that this was false economy. They pointed out that a fully equipped Spitfire cost £12,604, and housing it in a structure worth only a fraction of that value risked the entire investment, especially considering weather damage and enemy action. They were right about the vulnerability, but disastrously wrong about what really mattered. German reconnaissance flights over southern England in July and August 1940 had a peculiar problem. They could clearly spot the obvious targets, like RAF Biggin Hill, which was photographed on August 18th, showing dispersal areas, visible aircraft, and bomb craters from previous raids. But they couldn't detect the satellite airfields. Luftwaffe photo interpreters, trained to spot military installations, look for organizational signatures, geometric patterns, access roads, fuel storage tanks, and the regular spacing of buildings. British satellite airfields gave none of these clues. Take RAF Friston, for example, activated as a satellite for Big Gin Hill on July 2, 1940. The airfield appeared to be just a patch of grass, with nothing that stood out as military infrastructure. RAF Friston consisted of a 732-meter grass strip on farmland near the Sussex coast. There was no perimeter fence, and the operations room was housed in 2 requisitioned cottages. The aircraft shelters consisted of 6 bellman hangars and 4 wooden structures built to agricultural specifications, using standard barn framing with weatherboard cladding. Personnel lived in commandeered houses in a nearby village. From 1,500 meters, Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs showed scattered farm buildings, a grass field with sheep in one corner, and a narrow country lane. Nothing indicated any military significance. The deception extended beyond mere camouflage. RAF ground crew at these dispersed sites received explicit instructions about concealment discipline. A memo from Fighter Command in August 1940 specified that the agricultural appearance must be maintained at all times. Farm equipment, hay bales, and livestock were to remain visible in the photographs. Personnel were instructed not to create pathways or patterns that could suggest organized military activity. At Staplehurst, 616 Squadron Spitfires were stored in a barn alongside a reel tractor and hay storage. Flight Sergeant Maurice Cron recalled, "We'd service the Spitfire, then stack hay bales around it. If the Germans photographed us between sorties, they'd see a barn with hay. The Spitfire was 8 feet behind the opening, in shadow." The technical challenge was in rapid dispersal and recovery. A Spitfire's wingspan was 11.23 meters, just narrow enough to fit through standard barn doors with only 45 centimeters clearance on each side. Ground crew became exceptionally skilled at wing-walking aircraft into tight spaces. At RAF Limpton, airmen could move a Spitfire from open ground into concealment in under 90 seconds. This process required 6 men, 2 on the tail, 2 of the wingtips calling for clearance, and 2 inside the shelter guiding the aircraft to its precise position, ensuring maximum concealment while still allowing for rapid engine startup. Though this seemed like makeshift field expediency, it was invisible to German intelligence. Luftwaffe planning for the Battle of Britain assumed they understood the RAF's force structure. They estimated Fighter Command had around 900 fighters operating from about 40 major airfields. From this assumption, their strategy was clear: destroy the airfields, and you destroy the fighters. Between August 12 and September 6, 1940, the Luftwaffe carried out Operation Adlerangriff, specifically targeting RAF infrastructure. Bomber formations hit stations like Manston, Hawkinge, Limpton, Big Gin Hill, and Kenley repeatedly. These attacks achieved their tactical objectives with devastating precision. On August 18th, Kenley was hit by 100 bombs from Dornier Do-17s attacking at low level. 9 Hurricanes were destroyed, the operations room was demolished, and the station was rendered non-operational for 48 hours. Big Gin Hill suffered even worse, raided 6 times between August 30th and September 6th. The station lost all communications, had its operations room destroyed twice, and counted 39 personnel killed. By any measure, these were successful suppression raids. Yet, Fighter Command sortie rates barely wavered. On August 30th, the day Big Gin Hill was hammered, 11 Group flew 968 sorties. On August 31st, with Big Gin Hill still barely functional, 11 Group flew 978 sorties. The Luftwaffe couldn't understand the numbers. They were hitting airfields, seeing the damage in reconnaissance photos. But where were the aircraft coming from? The answer lay in those overlooked barns. Number 92 Squadron, nominally based at Big Gin Hill, had dispersed at Gravesend in 2 satellite sites on August 28th. When Big Gin Hill was attacked on August 30th, 92 Squadron Spitfires were housed in wooden shelters 3 kilometers away, untouched. The squadron flew 5 sorties that day, claiming 3 Bf-109s destroyed. To Luftwaffe intelligence, 92 Squadron should have been obliterated along with its parent airfield. Instead, it operated from structures German reconnaissance had photographed and dismissed. Squadron leader Ronald Lee, commanding 64 Squadron during this period, later wrote, The Germans were fighting the battle they prepared for, a campaign against fixed installations. We were fighting the battle that actually existed, keeping aircraft flying regardless of infrastructure. Every day Kenley or Biggen Hill was cratered. We operated from strips they didn't know existed, out of buildings they wouldn't waste bombs on. They thought they were winning because they could see the damage. They were losing because they couldn't see us. The confusion among the Germans is evident in captured documents. A Luftwaffe intelligence assessment from September 3, 1940, recovered post-war from Luftwaffe II archives noted, despite sustained attacks on identified RAF stations, enemy fighter strength appears undiminished. Reconnaissance shows extensive damage to major airfields, yet interception rates suggest fighter availability remains at 80 to 85% of estimated strength. The explanation remained unclear. They had photographed the answer dozens of times, but had trained themselves not to see it. The physical demands of operating high-performance fighters from agricultural sites demonstrated Britain's deeper strategic thinking. A Spitfire required specific, demanding needs, 87-octane petrol stored in clean conditions, proper coolant, and the necessary ground support equipment. However, the key was always flexibility and adaptability, ensuring that the aircraft could fly tomorrow regardless of the challenges faced today. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine required compressed air for gun charging, battery charging facilities, and protected workspace for daily inspections. The Luftwaffe ground organization provided all these through centralized infrastructure, fuel farms, dedicated workshops, and standardized equipment. The IAF, however, achieved this through improvisation elevated to doctrine. Fuel storage at satellite sites typically consisted of 200-liter drums stored in earth revetments covered with corrugated iron and turf. RAF Friston's fuel dump held 48 drums, spread across 6 separate locations around the field perimeter. This violated every principle of efficient logistics, as fueling required a lorry to collect drums and transport them to aircraft dispersal points. But it also meant that no single attack could wipe out the fuel stocks. At established airfields with centralized fuel farms, a single accurate bomb strike could ground an entire station. At satellite fields, destroying fuel required hitting 6 separate camouflage positions, each holding enough petrol for only 32 sorties. Armament presented similar challenges. A Spitfire MKI was equipped with 8.303 Browning machine guns, each requiring 300 rounds of belted ammunition. Standard procedure involved using compressed air to charge a pneumatic firing system and a specialized loader to feed ammunition belts into the wing bays. At established stations, armory sections had permanent workshops with proper equipment. At satellite sites, however, they used hand-crank compressors and improvised loading stands. The procedure took longer, around 35 minutes versus 20 minutes at major stations, but it also required no fixed infrastructure vulnerable to attack. This was not a haphazard adaptation. Fighter Command issued specific technical instructions governing satellite operations. TI of 400227, dated July 12, 1940, specified exactly how dispersed units would maintain operational capability with minimal facilities. The document outlined portable toolkits, emergency repair procedures to be executed in the field, and workarounds for routine maintenance that would normally require workshop infrastructure. One section stated that daily inspections, typically conducted in hangars, would be carried out in open dispersal, with top-hauling screens only erected if clean conditions were essential for specific tasks. Flight Lieutenant James Corbin, an engineering officer with 601 Squadron, recounted his experience at satellite operations. "We maintained Hurricanes in conditions that would have appalled the Luftwaffe," he said. Servicing in the open, tools stored in wooden crates, with the nearest workshop 3 miles away. Yet, serviceability rates stayed above 80%. The key was that everything, the procedures, the toolkits, the spare parts, was designed to function without any fixed infrastructure. German efficiency relied on meticulous organization. British efficiency required only petrol, ammunition, and skilled hands. This contrast in maintenance philosophies proved decisive during critical moments. On September 1, 1940, RAF Detling was attacked and put out of action. Hangars were destroyed, workshops demolished, and all infrastructure damaged. The squadron operating Blenheim night fighters was effectively grounded for a week while repairs were made. Meanwhile, 501 Squadron, flying Hurricanes from a satellite field near Detling, lost nothing. They had no hangars to destroy, no workshops to crater. Their infrastructure consisted of tools and lorries and petrol in drums. Within 2 hours of Detling being hit, 501 Squadron was back on defensive patrols as scheduled. This operational flexibility came at a cost, paid not in casualties, but in exhaustion. Servicing fighters in field conditions meant working in summer heat and autumn rain without shelter. At RAF Friston, Armor Sergeant Bill Green described a typical day. Up at 4:30, breakfast in a farmhouse kitchen, then out to the dispersal in darkness. We'd service the Spitfire with torches, hoping for no rain. If we needed to work on an engine, we'd push the aircraft into the barn, but that took 10 minutes we usually didn't have. Most work happened in the open, and in September, that meant cold hands and damp tools. But the aircraft flew. The physical conditions would have been considered unacceptable at Luftwaffe bases, where ground crews worked in proper facilities with adequate lighting, heating, and workspace. This apparent German advantage masked a critical vulnerability. Their comfort depended on infrastructure that could be destroyed, while British ground crews were uncomfortable but unstoppable. You can't crater a grass field enough to prevent operations. An A-field cratered on Tuesday could be filled with gravel and operational by Thursday. You can't destroy workshops that don't exist. You can't eliminate fuel farms that are, in reality, 48 drums scattered across a field perimeter. Pilots adapted to conditions that would seem almost absurd at German bases. At RAF Rufford, a satellite field, pilots of 54 Squadron were billeted in a public house 3 kilometers from dispersal. Scramble procedures required them to sprint to waiting lorries, be driven to the field at dangerous speeds, then run to their aircraft. The entire process, from the telephone call to the first aircraft airborne, took approximately 4 minutes. This was slower than the 2-minute scrambles at major stations, where pilots could sit in cool rooms adjacent to their aircraft. Yet, Rufford never appeared on Luftwaffe target lists because reconnaissance photographs showed it as an unremarkable civilian location. The grass field was dotted with scattered agricultural buildings. Squadron leader Bob Stanford Tuck, who flew Spitfires with 92 Squadron during the height of the Battle of Britain, later recalled, "We lived like gypsies, slept in farmhouses, ate from field kitchens, and flew from pastures." The Germans had proper stations with proper facilities, but when they bombed Big Gin Hill into rubble, we flew from a satellite they didn't know existed. When they hit that satellite, we flew from another. They could never quite figure out where we were because we weren't really anywhere. We were everywhere, and we were nowhere, and we were always flying. The success of Britain's dispersal and camouflage strategy rested not only on physical deception, but also on a psychological one. Luftwaffe intelligence officers were far from incompetent. They were trained to identify military targets based on established criteria developed from pre-war reconnaissance experience in peacetime military operations. These criteria emphasized organization, permanence, and efficiency, signatures that Fighter Command deliberately avoided. The British approach exploited a fundamental assumption in German military thinking, that modern warfare required modern infrastructure. This assumption wasn't wrong in many contexts. Tank formations required fuel depots and repair facilities. Artillery needed ammunition dumps and fire control positions. Air power, according to German doctrine, demanded proper airfields with hard surfaces, permanent buildings, and established support facilities. The Luftwaffe had built its entire organizational structure on this principle. The RAF, facing an existential threat, had abandoned it. Consider the intelligence failure from the German perspective. On August 15, 1940, Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed 73 potential RAF installations across southern England. Of these, 27 were identified as active fighter stations and targeted accordingly. Intelligence assessments estimated these stations housed around 600 fighters. The actual number was closer to 350. The remaining Fighter Command strength operated from 41 satellite fields and dispersed sites, locations reconnaissance had photographed but dismissed as non-military. The Germans weren't failing to photograph the threat. They were failing to recognize what the photograph showed. This cognitive blindness extended beyond aerial reconnaissance. Luftwaffe bomber crews reported attacking RAF airfields and achieving hits. Their reports were accurate. Bombs did strike Manstun, Kenley, Big Gin Hill, and other stations. What the reports didn't capture was that they were hitting only 40% of Fighter Command's operational infrastructure, while missing 60%. The mathematics of attrition favored Britain, not because British fighters were superior, though the Spitfire was arguably equal to or better than the Bf-109E, but because Luftwaffe intelligence never accurately assessed how many aircraft needed to be destroyed or where those aircraft were located. This discrepancy appears in German loss reports. On August 18, 1940, Luftwaffe formations attacked Kenley and seemingly neutralized it as an operational base. On the same day, however, fighters operating from Kenley's satellite sites in nearby dispersed fields shot down 24 German aircraft while losing 8. Luftwaffe intelligence assessed the day as strategically successful because reconnaissance showed Kenley devastated. Fighter Command counted it as tactically successful because the combat exchange rate was 3:1 in Britain's favor, and sortie rates remained largely unchanged. By early September, senior Luftwaffe commanders recognized something was amiss, though they didn't fully understand what. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, addressing fighter commanders on September 3rd, reportedly said, "We have destroyed their airfields. We have shot down their fighters. Yet still they come. Where are these aircraft?" The answer, located in barns and fields that his reconnaissance had photographed but his intelligence officers had ignored, would have seemed implausible. Modern air forces didn't operate that way, except the IAF did, and it worked. The ultimate validation didn't come from any single revelation, but from the steady mathematics of sustained operations. Between August 12 and September 6, 1940, the Luftwaffe flew 7,260 bomber and 9,500 fighter sorties against targets in southern England. IAF Fighter Command flew 11,679 sorties in response. The Luftwaffe lost 424 aircraft, while Fighter Command lost 273. More critically, the IAF never fell below 734 serviceable fighters, exactly where their strength stood at the campaign start. Standard attrition mathematics suggested Fighter Command should have collapsed. The Germans had numerical superiority, tactical initiative, and the ability to choose when and where to engage. They executed their planned campaign against IAF infrastructure with significant success. Every major fighter station in 11 Group was hit, many repeatedly. Yet, the correlation between infrastructure damage and operational capability never materialized. Fighter Command absorbed punishment that should have been crippling and maintained defensive capabilities that should have been impossible. The explanation lay in those overlooked barns and fields, unconventional, underestimated, and ultimately decisive. On September 6, 1940, IAF Kenley was rendered non-operational. Its landing ground was cratered, buildings were destroyed, and communications were severed. Yet, 64 Squadron, nominally based at Kenley, flew 18 sorties a day from Gravesend and a satellite field. To Luftwaffe planners, these sorties should not have existed. They had eliminated Kenley and photographed the damage. The fact that 64 Squadron continued to operate exposed a fundamental flaw in German intelligence. They had destroyed the airfield, not the squadron. The aircraft were hidden in structures too humble to target and operated from fields too numerous to suppress. Flight Lieutenant Alan Day, a New Zealand pilot flying Spitfires during the battle, later wrote, "The Germans never understood that we didn't need much. A flat field, petrol in drums, ammunition in crates, and sleep in farmhouses. They needed proper bases because their doctrine required them. We needed to keep flying because survival demanded it. When you're fighting over your own territory with your back to the wall, you'll operate from a plowed field if necessary." They thought they were fighting an air force. They were actually fighting a nation. The dispersal tactics that frustrated the Luftwaffe in 1941 abandoned after the Battle of Britain. They became formalized doctrine. By 1942, Fighter Command maintained 97 established stations and 214 satellite landing grounds. The ratio of infrastructure to operational capability had inverted. Rather than each squadron requiring substantial facilities, each facility required minimal infrastructure. This philosophy extended beyond Britain. When IAF squadrons deployed to North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe, they brought the same operational approach: disperse, conceal, and operate from minimal facilities. The contrast with later conflicts is telling. During the Cold War, NATO air forces developed hardened aircraft shelters, sophisticated camouflage systems, and elaborate deception measures. These systems cost billions and required extensive infrastructure. Yet, the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Aircraft that survive are aircraft that can fight. Modern air forces spending months constructing hardened shelters were following the same logic that put Spitfires in wooden barns, albeit with considerably more resources. The principle that made it work in 1940, that operational aircraft matter more than perfect facilities, remained the cornerstone of planning 40 years later. The Battle of Britain is one of history's clearest examples of intelligence failure due to assumption. The Luftwaffe had adequate reconnaissance, competent analysts, and reasonable doctrine. What they lacked was a cognitive flexibility to understand that their opponents might reject the basic premises of modern air warfare. German planning assumed RAF fighters required what German fighters required: proper bases, proper facilities, proper infrastructure. British planning assumed RAF fighters needed only three things: fuel, ammunition, and a flat place to land. The difference between these assumptions determined which air force could sustain operations under attack. No single wooden shelter determined the outcome of the Battle of Britain. No individual satellite field proved decisively important. What mattered was the cumulative effect of 214 dispersed sites, thousands of hours of operations without proper facilities, and the willingness to prioritize operational capability over every comfort and convenience that made proper military life bearable. The RAF won the Battle of Britain for many reasons: pilot skill, radar advantage, fighting over home territory, and German strategic errors. But underlying all these factors was a simple reality: you cannot destroy aircraft you cannot find. And you cannot find aircraft hidden in buildings you've been trained to ignore. The Luftwaffe photographed those barns dozens of times. German intelligence officers examined the images, measured the structures, assessed their military significance, and concluded they were agricultural buildings. They were correct by the standards of identification they had been trained to apply. They were also catastrophically wrong because those barns contained Spitfires. The failure wasn't in German competence, but in German assumptions. The assumption that modern fighters required modern facilities, that military installations looked military, and that Britain would fight the war Germany expected, rather than the war Britain needed to fight. On September 17, 1940, Adolf Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority despite overwhelming resources and initiative. Intelligence assessment struggled to explain how Fighter Command maintained its capability despite the documented destruction of its infrastructure. The answer sat in reconnaissance photographs filed as agricultural buildings, no military significance. Those photographs showed exactly what they appeared to show: wooden barns, hay bales, and farm equipment. They simply failed to show what else was there: Spitfires in the shadows, ready to fly, operated by ground crews who had learned to maintain cutting-edge fighters in conditions that their German counterparts would have deemed impossible. This wasn't victory through superior technology or overwhelming force. It was victory through accepting uncomfortable truths: that comfort costs time, perfection costs flexibility, and survival matters more than organization. The RAF put Spitfires in wooden barns because they understood something fundamental about modern warfare: the side that keeps fighting longest wins. Infrastructure can be rebuilt. Facilities can be repaired. But if your aircraft are destroyed because they are concentrated in obvious targets, no amount of infrastructure helps. Better to operate from a barn that survives than a concrete hangar that's been created. The Luftwaffe never quite understood what had beaten them. Post-war interviews with German commanders consistently reveal the same confusion. They had executed their plan properly, hit their targets accurately, and achieved their tactical objectives. They destroyed RAF airfields, but they simply hadn't destroyed the RAF, because the RAF wasn't really at those airfields. It was everywhere else, in places German intelligence had photographed and dismissed, operating from facilities too primitive to seem credible. In the end, it wasn't sophistication that saved Britain. It was a willingness to hide Spitfires in wooden barns while the Luftwaffe looked for concrete hangars, and to fly from field their enemy had literally photographed but couldn't believe were military airfields.